Hi everybody and welcome to tonight's webinar. Thanks for coming. I would like to begin by acknowledging that this webinar is being hosted on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as elders from the lands of all who are joining us tonight. I'd like to acknowledge that today is National Sorry Day and that policies such as the forced removal of people from their homes, families and communities has had long-term consequences for them and also for country. I'd also like to acknowledge the strength and resilience of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the oldest and longest living culture on Earth. So I got a little bit emotional there. We did a planting day today at CERES for Sorry Day, and I think I really sort of tapped into it properly for the first time, and yeah, just feeling deep sort of sadness and appreciation for Indigenous people in this country today and those stolen generations in particular. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, Yin. I'll introduce Yin in a moment. My name is Sita Beckwith and I'm the Narrative Director at CERES. This is the last of our little autumn mini-series of webinars hosted by our School of Nature and Climate. These webinars were inspired by the words of Aboriginal Elder and Senior Australian of the Year, Miriam Rose Ungunmerr Baumann. In her acceptance speech earlier this year, Miriam Rose said, "Now is the time for you to come closer to understand us. We have learned to speak the white man's language. We have listened to what he had to say. This learning and listening should go both ways." And so tonight we have this incredible opportunity to listen to Yin, and I'm looking forward to hearing from him in what I hope will be a lovely non-linear yarn. I think linearity is a bit overrated. So Yin and I will chat for about 20 minutes to begin with, and then we'll open up the Q&A for anybody else to ask questions. So to give you a proper introduction, Yin, Dr. Yin Paradies is an Aboriginal-Asian-Anglo Australian of the Wakaya people from the Gulf of Carpentaria. He is a professor of race relations at Deakin University, where he conducts research on racism and anti-racism, as well as teaching and researching Indigenous knowledges and decoloniality. Yin is a climate and ecological activist who is committed to understanding and interrupting the devastating impacts of modern societies. He seeks meaningful mutuality of becoming and embodied kinship with all life through transformed ways of knowing, being and doing that are grounded in wisdom, humility, respect and generosity. Thanks so much for being here with us tonight, Yin.
Thanks, Sita.
I think the first time I met you, Yin, was also in a Zoom format, and you were presenting on a wellbeing economies course, and you were in a car that was moving at the time, and initially I thought you were actually driving, which seemed very futuristic, if slightly worrying way of presenting to a crowd of people. I later found out you were not driving, which was a relief. But I was left with this impression of someone naturally embracing technology and somehow being at home and comfortable and centered in yourself whilst in transit. So I wonder if you could maybe start by offering some thoughts on how, as listeners, we can arrive here with you in this moment, to be at home in ourselves, attentive to the conversation, even if things around us are a bit moving and chaotic. So really sort of how do we best listen in this format is what I'm asking.
Yes, good question. I think we lack a lot of that ability to be present in this in modern societies where most of us are enmeshed in some or another. It is actually just not resisting the flow of existence and going with the currents of the river of life a little bit more, with a little bit more humility and grace. It's sort of a letting go, really, of a sense of how things should be and just sinking into the reality of how things are, how everything is, how the world is unfurling and unfolding before us at every moment. And when we do that, I think we can better feel into the sacred in-between spaces that constitute the living cosmos. We can yield better, but we can also learn to resonate and attune with ourselves, and the vast articulations of self that form the world. Yeah, that's a long-winded answer to a probably could have been a simpler answer to that, but anyway, that's it.
I don't think it was long-winded. I really, as you were talking then, just sort of, settled a bit into myself and just got a sense of expansion and calm. So thank you for offering that. I think today in particular, with all of the COVID stuff that's happening in Melbourne, I feel this kind of sense of urgency arising again, and it's very hard to feel grounded. So thanks for the reminder. I like that bit about yielding. That was, So as you touched on a little bit just there, in your academic work, you seem able to weave in concepts like this sacred connection, like you just mentioned then, this sort of sense of the things in between. And also you talk about kinship and stories. And in your work, that's woven in with epistemologies, ontologies, axologies, and all these other ologies that I've mostly forgotten since I was a philosophy undergraduate. So I wonder if you could sort of explain to begin with what's sort of the heart of your work for people who are listening on this call tonight.
Well, I would say the heart of my work really stems from a kind of decolonial understanding of the world, which I could summarize like this. It's an understanding that nothing is complete, perfect, or enduring, but all is alive, sentient, profoundly relational, and deeply sacred. So that's kind of, I would say, that's a kind of ontological way, or a decolonial ontology of the world. So it's what the world is made of, the nature of reality. That's ontology. I would say the epistemology of decoloniality, that, as I understand it, is epistemology is a way of knowing the world. So I would say that is, we could summarize that as, we are all immersed in unsensed existences, which we can strive to perceive, to inhabit, to commingle and grow with. So it's an expansive sense of unknown worlds that we are yet to experience. And I'd say the axiology of decoloniality, as I would describe it, so axiology is about values, morals, ethics, would be something like this. We are all called to conscious, embodied, loving, reverent co-liberation with each other and the living cosmos that we are, of course, profoundly relational to.
That's a beautiful description, and I'm glad we're recording, because I'm going to have to go back and reflect on that later. I'm really glad to have a record of that. I love that. Just, I'm kind of aware, I think of academic writing as not having particularly beautiful language, and I think those different ologies that you described there had a real sense of beauty and life in them in a way that I don't often sort of come across. And I guess one thing that I was reading in your paper that you shared with me, which we'll share with the listeners, we can send it out to everybody after the call, and you talk about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, or the indicators of the end days of modernity. And these are debt, property, institutions, and nation states.
Yes.
So I'm sure there's a lot to be said about these 4 horsemen, but I just wondered, as we've touched on just now, as an academic, you're obviously working inside an institution, which is those 4 horsemen. So I wondered if you could say a bit about how you embarked on that journey of academia, what drew you to it, and what you see as the role of Indigenous knowledges within the university.
Yes. I would say academia is one of the many problematic institutions that continue to exist in the world, colonial institutions. And in my paper, I call for the abolishment of universities, among other institutions. So it's a place of paradox, that I am existing within that institution primarily. Of course, I intersect with lots of institutions. They're very hard to avoid in this day and age. The kind of handmaidens of the nation state are the manifold institutions that kind of constrict and constrain and control our lives. So I think there's a very contradictory and difficult place of Indigenous knowledge in the academy, and I think it's really hard for academic institutions to authentically engage with Indigenous paradigms and knowledges because of the deep colonial history of education in general, and especially higher education, as it's so inappropriately called. So yeah, I think that's a big issue, and there has been sort of attempts at inclusion, but often it's a co-option of some sort, and a kind of mutation and morphing and warping of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing that become embedded in various courses in universities. I myself was called to academia early in life, but it's a big place, academia, and originally my interest in becoming an academic was to work as a theoretical physicist. So I started my studies as a theoretical physicist and changed very much over the course of undergraduate and postgraduate to become interested in racism and decoloniality, which I very much are my key interests at this point. And I think difficult to make authentic embedding of that in the academy, but there's it's a place where you can work from at a pinch to try and spread ideas of decoloniality.
Do you find you're quite clear about your approach to this, that there is a contradiction in there? Do you get any sort of pushback from the institution, or are you don't experience that too much? Like, are you invited in with your approach, or do you have to sort of fight for it.
Yes, it is. There is a fairly open invitation from a lot of people. I mean, I get a lot of invitations. I'm sure there are a lot of people who don't have any interest in inviting me. The majority, no doubt. But yes, people do find it quite challenging at times, and I guess I'm not always saying what people want to hear, and so repeat invites are less frequent. Let's put it that way.
You also just mentioned just now that you started out as a theoretical physicist, but then you've changed and are now focused on slightly other things. Can you say anything about that change? Is it just been a natural evolution of your career, or are there like a couple of things that led to this transformation of approach?
Oh, I think it's mostly, life is mostly being buffeted by circumstance and surprise opportunity that you know, as they say, if you want to make God laugh, tell her your plans. So yeah, planning is a interesting pastime, but otherwise not particularly relevant to predicting the future. I was just found myself in various jobs that changed my understanding of the world and steered me away from physics to kind of health statistics, and then public health and Indigenous health. It was part of that from an early stage, and progressively less quantitative, more qualitative, and yes, happenstance. You know, inspiring people that I've found, authors, books that I found to read, have been part of that journey. I think yes, very much influenced by writers, yeah, of various kinds who have been, you know, leading the way in understanding racism and health, and then decoloniality and Indigenous knowledges, and yeah.
One of the things, going back to your paper, is you talk about Indigenous sovereignty as being an oxymoron, given the colonial meaning of sovereignty, which is, as I understand it, rights over property and rights over other people, and that Indigenous wisdom would teach that the land owns us and not the other way around. Normally, at the start of a webinar or workshop, I usually say sovereignty was never ceded. And I think that's a pretty common statement these days from people who are probably trying to be good allies to Aboriginal people. I actually took it out tonight, partly because of your perspective in the paper, and partly because I want to think a bit more about what it really means before I just go ahead and say it. Like, I think we pick up these things and we say them, but I would like to sort of consider it more. The one thing that your approach reminded me was that, of course, not all Aboriginal people agree with each other. And in fact, from what I understand about Indigenous approaches, there's this ability that you mentioned earlier to hold opposing perspectives at once in a kind of larger truth. And I think this is something that dominant society needs to learn, in fact, rather urgently needs to learn. And I can even see how we need to learn that at CERES. You know, how can we hold opposing viewpoints without seeing them as opposing? So I wonder if this concept of Indigenous sovereignty being an oxymoron, is that a controversial viewpoint? And also, what does Indigenous knowledge teach us about how we can embrace the viewpoints to our own?
Yes, I think it is a controversial viewpoint, you know, among Indigenous scholars and decolonial scholars. It's just very, very colonial to me. I mean, sovereignty, of course, comes from the word sovereign, which is just the king, the ruler, the person in charge of everyone else, which is doesn't sound very Indigenous or decolonial to me. So I'm not a big fan of sovereignty. But yeah, it's good to have obviously diversity of views, and sometimes we can get, as well, I can get as an academic a little bit too caught up in the meaning of words. It can be a little bit of semantics, perhaps, and is useful in its own way, but not as important as what people actually do. Action and flowing in the world is much more important. One of the key features of Indigenous thinking is, and being and doing, is holding multiple contradictory things. Paradox. In many ways, paradox is the building block of the universe, and both thinking may be useful at times as a complement to either or thinking. So yeah, what if we considered ourselves more often to be both right and wrong in various ways, or on the right path and also generously lost? These things are both very important aspects of life. Happy and grieving at the same time. Settled, but also unsettled. And perhaps even, now I'm going to get in real trouble, we could also consider ourselves to be both Indigenous and non-Indigenous.
How do you think we go about practicing that? Like, is it something that we just do in our own minds? Do we find, like, kind of, I don't know, I hate to use the word safe spaces, but do we find those spaces where we can practice that? Like, I'm not really sure.
Yes, safe spaces are very important. Yep, creating safe spaces. I think part of it stems from just a radical indeterminacy of all that is, so really feeling that unknowability of life and feeling that sense of being able to, you start by practicing things like when someone asks you a question saying, I don't know. That's a good way to start. Yeah. And then you say, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And then you think, actually, maybe it's both. And you resist what's called premature closure. You resist a sort of certainty that perhaps hasn't emerged fully for you. So it's okay to not know. It's okay to change your mind. It's okay to delve deeper into yourself before you come up with anything that even sounds remotely certain about a topic, and avoid premature closure and also premature disclosure, especially of answers. Oh, you've asked me a question, so this is the answer. Try not to do that for a day or two, and then you'll probably get a pretty good sense of where the safe spaces are to continue practicing that.
I once did an online course, I think it was in the middle of COVID last year, and part of the course was a series of fasts that you could do. And the first fast was a news fast, and the second fast was judgment of others fast. And I can't remember what, there was 4 weeks of it, but I like this idea. I feel like I need to fast from, providing answers.
Yes, good. Fasting, I like it. Yeah.
It brings it into a kind of ritual practice in that way. I think. Yeah.
Yes. We need to fast from judging ourselves as well. That's kind
that was something. I think that was the third fast. That was the third fast, was judging ourselves. Yeah. Yeah, and actually the first fast around that, not watching the news, brought about the next fasts. I found it was like, as soon as you stopped having inputs from the outside world, like you weren't watching the news, so you had to kind of think of things for yourself, and the inputs are, you don't have all this information coming at you. You kind of, I then was like, oh, well, looking to other people for inputs, and then you start to judge other people. And then once I started that fast, I was like, okay, well, I'm not getting inputs from the news, I'm not judging others. And then I sort of turned it back on myself immediately. So it was really interesting, that sequence of fasts. And I just really love this idea of yours, like fasting from answers. It's great.
So good.
I'll practice from now. I thought I really loved this piece that you wrote about moving away from modern ways of living and into future ways of living. And you say, I am by no means advocating for immediate, widespread mass urban exodus to rural and remote areas. Rather, a repurposing of existing infrastructure combined with gradual attenuation of population density is preferable.
Yes.
As they were for the vast majority of our history as a species, these communities, future communities, would epitomise a grounded normativity of loving, intimate, respectful, affirmative, complex and regenerative place-based attachments that require embodied morality through the land rather than working against the land. I love that sort of beautiful list of values that might one day be considered normal, respect and affirmation. I love how you go into articulating what a future vision might be of a healed society. And it's sort of quite the opposite of what I see in the sheep deserts that we've created across this country, or the suburban landscapes we've fenced off around our properties. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about what you mean by finding morality through the land. I thought that was a really interesting.
Yes. Well, the land, or I guess country more generally, which includes land, air and sea and waters of various forms, and of course all the life that's on the land and in the sea and travelling through the air. Country is a better, bigger, more inclusive term, but country is a very good teacher for us if we learn to listen and to feel into natural law, L-O-R-E, so law of the land. I mean, basically we're living within, upon, as part of the most incredible, wondrous, awe-inspiring living being ever found in the known universe, sometimes called Gaia. And she's a wonderful teacher. So morality through the land means learning how to respond and stay with trouble in our lives by sensing into how that happens in nature. How to, including other humans, how does life respond to trouble? When is trouble beautiful? When is it more ugly? And what does morality actually mean as a framework that's divorced from an embodied existence? I believe in morality as a free-floating framework. I think morality has to be embedded and embodied and bounded and grounded and mixed in with the physical world that we're in. So yeah, learn from nature, really, as you're part of it, and then you learn to become more in touch with your entanglement and immersion in nature. We're all nature anyway, but I think morality can be too abstract and not practical enough, too kind of logical, rational, not messy and contradictory and paradoxical. And if you feel in to what country says and speaks to us, you can respond really very well to moral conundrums, very much a flowing sense of presence in a moment, in a place. So morality happens in time and in place, not in some sort of abstract framework of principles. That's what I'm trying to say.
I guess not only not abstract, but not imposed from somebody in a hierarchy above us.
Absolutely, yes. We need to integrate within ourselves where we're coming from and what makes us feel that we've made a decision that is something that we feel good about, basically. Morality should be deep integration of feelings and desires and longings and yearnings, and then acting from that deep integration, not an imposition from above, or not being subject to the judgment of others. We judge ourselves. Others can also judge us if they so choose, but the judgment of ourselves is most important. We have such vast selves that we mostly cage and slice off into bits and box and grid and flatten. And if we just sense into that expansiveness, we'd be so much more capable of navigating the world with ease and joy.
A friend of mine recently was reflecting on where we find moral courage at this time as well. She was sort of, because I think the times require great courage, actually. Yeah, and I can sort of sense there about, having morality kind of infusing in us from the land. You don't feel separate from the land. It's like the courage doesn't have to come from just within you, little person. The courage is part of the rest of the world in a way, if that makes sense.
Oh yes. It's not all up to us at all. We're not alone. We're never alone. We're always part of larger menageries of being, greater communities of communion. And yeah, it's about tapping into that and sensing and delving and kind of letting yourself sink into that truth. And then the courage comes from a much, much bigger space. Yeah.
You've also just reminded me, my colleague at work, we were talking one day, I don't know how we got onto it, it's what things we talk about in the opposite series, about the differences between Christianity and like the Vedic texts. And she observed that Christianity is all about saying you're a sinner, you're a sinner, you're a sinner. And the Vedic texts are all about saying you're divine, you're divine, you're divine. And that she would obviously choose your divine one. But I feel like what you're saying here is actually something in between. It's neither sinner nor divine, or it's both. It's both and, I guess, isn't it? We need to find a middle way or something.
Well, yes, I think it's always complex and messy, but I'm certainly not a fan. I would say I have issues with both of those traditions, I guess. There's a lot of what people call spiritual bypassing that goes on these days, and it's just more generally the kind of ontological basis of spiritual traditions, modern spiritual traditions. Well, first of all, the sinner thing is awful. I mean, this sense that people are inherently evil or born from original sin, or it's awful. It's very judging and condemning and controlling and manipulative. And I don't believe in good or evil. So I don't think there's such a thing as good or such a thing as evil. I think those are an effect of a kind of abstract morality that's divorced from the embodied experience of existence. But at the same time, I have real issues with transcendence. So the idea that there's something, as I've said already, all is sacred. And so you could say all is divine, but that is every part of the material universe. The material is infused with the spiritual. It's not some sort of sense of transcendence from the material world to some higher plane of being, whether that's heaven or whatever. I don't believe that in that. I think that everything that is divine and sacred is here with us, around us, in us, part of us, entangled with us. And so there's a term that Timothy Morton uses, which is subscendence instead of transcendence. So to descend into the earth, to connect, to relate, to belong to the majesty of the sacred material universe is what we need to do, rather than sort of transcendence. It's a bit like Elon Musk going to Mars, you know. We don't need to go anywhere to find truth and beauty.
I love that subscendence. It's beautiful. I've not come across that before. I really love that as a concept of going in and going deeper rather than transcending. It's beautiful. I'm going to invite people to put their questions into the Q&A section when they're ready. And just a reminder for everybody that it's the Q&A, not the chat. I actually can't see the chat, so stick it into the Q&A if you don't mind. So while I'm waiting for people to jump in with those questions, I had this question around, you talk about rather than a call to return land to Indigenous peoples, you're asking that all people return to the land. And that due to the ravages of colonisation, there are now too few Indigenous people only that can take care of what has become a sick country. And then you also suggest that the ongoing destruction and neglect of country are of more importance and concern than which humans claim possession. And I think this really speaks to the urgency of the times, but it also contains an invitation for both non-Indigenous and Indigenous people to take responsibility of caring for the country. And so I wondered if there are some ways that you are already seeing people come together in this way to take care of country.
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of people who care about country, and some of those people care for the country that they live on, whether they own it or whether they are just in a Western sense or whether they're just passing through. Some people go out to country to care for land or to put their bodies on the line to stop trees being murdered. There's many beautiful acts of resistance and refusal that go on, and partly those are examples, but also people who live on kind of communities that they've created, intentional communities, where they come together in groups of dozens or hundreds to an ongoing way, really, to care for land and to try and understand what the land needs, to listen to the needs of the place that we're in. What's part of the land is suffering, what's hurting, we've had 200 years of serious damage, and it's created a lot of problems, and we need a lot more people caring for land, whether directly or indirectly, like integrating. When I say integrating, I mean something like this. How are your needs or your desires or your consumptions, how are they met in this world that we live in? And if you integrate the full experience of that, everything from the slaves that we all continue to have in the third world that work for us, to your work colleagues or the people you live with, how are you enhancing the beauty of the world in the way your needs are met, in the way your desires are met, in the way you are made to be full, you're made to be satiated in life. So we destroy the land indirectly by consuming things that other people create through careless approaches to and relationships with country. So it's not just what we do directly, it's integrate the indirectness of your life. Modernity is all about indirectness. It's all about erasure and invisibilizing things. But let's surface those things by delving deeper, surface those things and integrate, and then make choices based on that integration.
Yeah, I love that. Integrate the indirectness of your life. I think I have a bit of work to do. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions in here. Aileen says, thank you, Yin, for your sharing your thoughts and time. You've written previously around anti-racism and reflexive anti-racism. Have your thoughts on this changed over time? And if so, how?
Well, my thoughts on things change, yes, quite often. In this case, I don't have anything particularly to disagree with myself on in relation to those papers and topics, except to say that racism, I would now consider racism to be a symptom rather than some sort of primary cause. All the isms are symptoms of the modern way that we conduct our lives, which include the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So racism is caused by things like debt, things like private property, institution, nation states, and more broadly, the way that we have hierarchies of value in the world. People are valued differently through these hierarchies, but these hierarchies run deep within us. This temptation to judge and condemn and compare and then create, ladders of worth. So these deeper ways of being and becoming are the cause of racism, in my understanding. So yes, read a paper on reflexive anti-racism if you want. I wrote one, but don't expect racism to be solved until these afflictions of modernity are addressed.
What actually is reflexive anti-racism?
Well, it's just this idea that it's a good idea that we should reflect more. When I talk about integration, I guess I'm saying, where do you have time in your life and space and energy and focus to actually reflect, to maybe it's meditation, maybe it's just a presence, a vitality of self in the moment, in the place, in space-time. And that is a privilege to reflect. In fact, it's very much discouraged in contemporary societies because strange and wonderful and metamorphic things can happen when people have that privilege to reflect. Much better if you were to watch another reality TV show and never have time from the perspective of modernity.
Yeah. There's a question in here from Ange, and I'm not quite sure, so I'm not sure what they mean, so I'm going to read it out and hopefully you might know what they mean, Yin. They say, are you happy to say more about a relational ontological positionality and maybe explore some specific ways that might change perspective and focus in both our culture and policy? I mean, I actually am not sure what is meant by relational ontological positionality, but perhaps you can.
Well, it's a good question. I don't know exactly what that means either, but I have mentioned that at times, so I suppose I better have a stab at explaining it. It's really what I was getting at before, I think, is this idea that we are relation. It's not so much that I said before that everything is profoundly relational, but what I really meant is that things are an illusion. So one of the aspects of modernity is thingification, as we call it. So making things out of doings and beings. So in Indigenous languages, most of the words, say 70% of the words, are verbs and 30% are nouns. It's inverted in English and other colonial languages often. 70% are nouns and 30% are verbs. So there's a lot of fixing and form making instead of flowing and doing. So in coloniality, there's more of that fixing. So what I'm trying to say is relational ontologies are just acknowledging that our position is fluid, that we are made up of relations, and we just appear to be things. That's not just, I'm not going to go on about it much longer, but an example is a piece of string. If you get a piece of string and tie a knot in it, maybe you show it to a small child or something, they might think that knot is separate from the string. It appears to be separate, looks like it's sort of on top of or somehow connected in a way that could be taken apart from the string. But you can't take a knot off a string. Well, that knot is us, and the strings are nearly infinite relational flows. And so you can't divorce things from relation. How people can understand that culturally and policy is a bit of a lost cause. I wouldn't even go there. Policy is an incredibly Western idea. But I think that just talking about this stuff with people is really good for changing culture and inviting people to think about the world, to feel the world, to sense the world in a different way. That's not just about things. Even the term thingification is pretty interesting for people. So we must find ways of transforming and metamorphosizing ourselves, and then just simply just being otherwise. So other hyphen wise in another way is enough to influence others. Yeah, I think I'm not a big fan of seeking change. I think that we shouldn't seek, we should be sought. And that means to be attuned, to resonate with the living cosmos, and then just trust that what we do will ripple and influence outwards. So don't be too focused on change, because to focus on change is to stifle change in many ways.
And I guess sort of it's another form of colonization in a way, is to try and bring about change, is to kind of bring your human-centered ideas into a world that's got enough sort of humans.
Yes, to try and impose the human-centered anthropomorphic realities onto the more than human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You just reminded me, there's a story, his name's Andrew Skiok. I don't know if you've come across him. He's a audio ecologist, and he's very passionate about birds. He's got some great TED Talks and visuals about birds. And he was being taken by a couple of Indigenous rangers to a remote place to go bird watching to their country. And they'd travelled, it's a very long journey, they're on a dirt road. And they were hours bumping around in their troopy or whatever across the dirt road to get to the country. And then when they arrived, the rangers said to him, "Oh, we're going to sit down here now and just be quiet for a while." And Andrew said, "Oh, so that we can listen to country." And the ranger said, "No, that's not why we do it." And Andrew was like, "Why do we do it?" And he said, "It's so country can listen to us." Country doesn't know you. You're a stranger. You need to sit there and be quiet so that country can listen to you. And I really, for me, that really flipped this kind of human-centric thinking that we have about even environmentalism. Like, you know, I passionately wanted to save the world. But then there's this kind of thinking that just says it's not that way around. Like, we're not the heroes of this story.
No. And yes, country is alive and sentient, and it needs to get to know you and to trust you before it'll say too much. too much levels of communication can happen as the depth of relationship emerges. Heroes, heroes are definitely a dangerous concept. There's a lot of heroes in our culture, in our milieu, and superheroes as well. But it's a very individualistic idea, I think, heroes, and I think it's dangerous mostly. And better not to be a hero, better to just be a complex, messy, wondrous being and becoming. And it's not about fame or fortune or powers beyond that of others. Simply, learning, listening, being attuned, being receptive to how you can contribute to the beauty of the world, and being present, seeking truth, belonging, care, kindness, respect. These are very easy things to say, but they're actually very hard to do.
Yeah.
Worthy of the effort.
But there's this, like, I wonder, like, for me, it feels like there's a big sort of gap between that way of becoming and where we are now in our beingness. I mean, even just now talking about thingification, I heard the other day that the total weight now of all of the stuff that we've created, dead stuff, is more than the total weight of life, living beings on the planet.
Yes.
We're in sort of dire circumstances here, and I just, I don't know. I mean, how to step into that way of becoming rather than being and creating stuff.
Well, I think it's not a linear process. So it comes in that kind of sense of sudden epiphany and transformation, metamorphosis. It's inhabiting a new self that simply doesn't desire those things anymore, can't tolerate those things anymore, and then they pass. And there's many ways of living a simple, frugal, sufficient existence. I mean, it's not, there's no perfection. I'm not talking about perfection here. I'm not talking about any sense of moral high ground or exonerating yourself. We're all guilty as charged of existing in such a world. But if we resist and we refuse and we create alternatives, we seed alternatives, that's the best we can do. And a simple thing like consuming less, recycling, composting, caring for living things wherever you find them, and wherever you can integrate them on the pathway of actions that provide for your ongoing existence, then that's a beautiful, worthy action to take. Yeah.
And I guess those actions are worth doing regardless of the outcome, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Have intrinsic value, which is...
Yes. We should all be very much equanimous and largely unconcerned with the outcomes. I think it's all about process. I would say the means are the ends. And so therefore you act with integrity in each moment and each place where you're situated. The outcome is largely irrelevant.
One thing that I found in your work, which is something that I struggle to do, and I think our culture probably struggles to do, is to try and articulate a vision of the future that we're working towards that's not a utopia, because everybody knows utopias don't really work out very well, and are impossible to attain anyway. It's sort of, I guess I've started to think of them as a counter dystopian vision. I've read, so I came across some of your writing. It was in the Future Now project, I think, and I think it might have also been in Dumbo Feather. And you had this really beautiful snapshot of what a beautiful world could look like. And it wasn't much of a step from where we are now, actually. And you mentioned the idea of a Boonsday clock app. I really love that. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about what that is and what it represents for you.
Boonsday clock. Well, you're testing my memory now. I do remember writing that down. It's kind of a humorous reflection of the doomsday clock, I guess. So boons are kind of stepping stones on our fateful stepping stones on the pathway of life. They're always challenging in the sense of transformative, but it's just a clock that is not focused on linear, dissected sort of time, but more circular spiral senses of time as something that you prioritize in moments of change, really. Like a boon is an opportunity for change. So the clock is just really, it's a clock to honor epiphanies. Let's call it an epiphany clock. And that's the sort of clock we need more of. Where can we celebrate and honor and respect and spread the word about epiphanies that people are having that change them, not so much doom that's upon us, but the boons that can bring, the benefits, the opportunities for becoming otherwise. And because it's not linear, because the world is not a linear place, it's an emergent, transformative, chaotic, complex, self-organizing system. We don't know how change will emerge. It's quite possible that things may turn out quite differently to the predictions that are floating around at the moment. Could be a good way, could be a bad way. We may redefine what we think of good and bad in the process. So that's what I meant by the Boonsday clock. Yeah.
I really love that reminder of, like, we don't actually know what the future will hold. As much as we have fear and panic, well, I personally do right now, if I sort of engage with how I think the world is, where we find ourselves, it is a good reminder that we don't actually know. There is mystery, and there is hope. I mean, maybe there's not hope of saving the world in the way that the heroes that we thought might, but maybe we can be saved. I don't know.
Yes. It's not a heroic sort of savior thing. It's a kind of a we don't need to save the world. I think we need to be with the world, care for the world as we find it, and go on that journey with the world as it becomes something, becomes elseness, becomes it's always change is a constant. So to save is a sort of fixing, and we want the flowing form of saving, which is more like support on a journey, I think. Difficult journey.
Yeah, I like that. Save is a form of fixing. I've never thought about that. But I also like that reminder to stay with the trouble. I think that's excellent. I really like that. Well, we've sort of ticked over into our hour already. But I wondered if there was anything that you wanted to say that sort of is with you right now? I know it's a fairly open question, but, you know, I would like you to say, you know, if there's anything else that you'd like to share, please let us know.
Yes, I would like to read a short poem in conclusion.
Cool.
It goes like this. Yield to the deep truths of space, time, matter, meaning, embodiment, and experience. Relinquish our polite diminishments and constrained alienations. Surrender, shapeshift, metamorphise, vibrate, resonate, and reverberate at the speed of trust. Become squeezed, shredded, devoured, digested, and metabolized by the world. Enter vastness, expansiveness, yearning, and belonging. That's my invitation.
Oh, so beautiful. I love that. It just, yeah, I think I'm going to go away feeling expansive, expanded somehow, and, you know, grounded. Love that first word, yield. I think that was sort of something you said earlier in our conversation as well. I think there's something in that at the moment. Are you able to share that with us? So can we send it out to people? Is that the poem?
Sure. Yeah, I can. Yep. I will send it to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sita.
Thank you, Yin. That was so good. I feel like, I don't know, it's like being sitting in front of a warm fire or something talking to you tonight. So thank you.
Yes, fireside chats. That's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Hopefully we won't be precluded from those too much in the coming waves of COVID-related mania that will grip us.
Yes.
Yes.
I know. Well, your, just to mention before people switch off, your Decolonial Futures gathering is online. So even if people are in a COVID mania, they can still come.
Yes.
It's on the 27th of June. We can send people a link. Do you want to say anything about that little workshop that you're offering?
Yes, it's a small gathering online. Well, it might be a few people there now. There's a few people who've suggested they'll come along. There might be 60, 70 people. And we will gather and discuss things and non-things. It will sound, you know, somewhat similar to this, but it goes for about 3.5 hours, a little bit longer. And there's some wonderful activities, that interactive stuff that people can get involved with that are much more exciting than just simply question and answers in small groups. So yeah, come along if you can on a Sunday Arvo at the end of June and enjoy some more decolonial perspectives.
Thanks so much, Yin. Yeah, and I just want to thank everybody for coming and offering their listening in this space too. I really feel a sense of others out there listening. And I wanted to thank Maria, my colleague at CERES, who's been helping host this, and also Sophie, who's been doing work in the background. There's a few thank yous coming in from the audience, so thank you again, Yin, and we will send everybody a follow-up email with any links, and also we've recorded the video, so we'll share it with people who missed out or who want to listen to it again, because I think there's a lot in there. So thanks, Yin.
Thank you. Thank you, Sita. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
Very well.
Good night.